you're like us, you're probably tired of flipping through outdated and expensive regulation books and struggling to understand the rule or guidance you're after. E-Regs is the first web and mobile app version of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations, helping fleets of all types and sizes better access and understand their regulatory obligations. E-Regs is always up to date and allows fleet safety professionals to not only read the rules, but also dig into FMCSA guidance and learn more about complex regulatory topics from industry experts. Highlight, bookmark, and take detailed notes right from the app and access them on any of your devices. And easily share a digital version of the regulations with your drivers so that they too can better understand the rules. E-Regs was developed by safety professionals for safety professionals. Try it out for free at eregs.app. All right, everyone, welcome to episode 48 of Trucksafe Live, a show where we and our guests tackle the hot button issues impacting highway transportation. I'm Brandon, that's Rob, that's Brian. We're with Trucksafe, which is dedicated to helping motor carriers develop and maintain cutting-edge safety programs. Welcome, everybody. Glad you're here with us. If you're here with us, say hey in the comments so we know who's around. Rob, Brian, what's going on?
Good stuff, exciting stuff.
Thursday.
Yeah. It's Thursday, yeah.
What kind of exciting stuff do you have going on a Thursday, Brian?
This was the most exciting thing of my day. So I've been waiting all day for this.
That's what I like to hear. Anyway. Thanks again for everybody joining us today. Obviously kind of a breaking news type reason for the show with President Trump's executive order coming down earlier this week. Put out a detailed article on this on our website. It's already gotten a lot of attention, and just kind of monitoring the social media feeds seems to be a pretty polarizing subject for some. And so I thought it would be a good idea to jump on here because it affects trucking, obviously, and get to the bottom of it, explore it. There's 100 different ways we can go with it. So that's what we're going to do. I'm excited to have a kind of a roundtable discussion. Got a couple of friends of ours to join us a little bit later here in a few minutes. Before we bring them on, a few things going on at Trucksafe that we should mention, as always. First up, we should thank the sponsor of this show, which is Taking the Higher Road, special podcast dedicated to addressing the trucking industry's greatest challenges, driver recruiting, retention, and compliance. Each episode, host Jeremy Raymer, 20-year industry veteran, interviews industry experts and thought leaders who bring their insights to the driver lifecycle. Be sure to check them out wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks to Taking the Higher Road. All right, things going on at Trucksafe. If you're not a member of the Trucksafe network, I encourage you to join it. It is free to join over at trucksafenetwork.com, or scan that QR code there and download the app in the App Store or the Google Play Store. This is the space we've built for fleet safety professionals to gather together, learn from one another, ask questions, and also access all of our DOT-related content that we push out regularly, including a webinar that we just did called Is Your Fleet Audit Ready? Brian, Rob, Jared, Tyler, and I spent about an hour and a half breaking down DOT audits, what fleets should know about those in order to make sure that you're prepared for one. God forbid you get the knock at the door. So that was a well-attended webinar. I got a lot of great questions and feedback from those who attended. So that's the type of content that we're pushing out through the network. So we hope to see you there. And then lastly, I'll just mention our upcoming Fleet Compliance Bootcamp. This is our in-person conference that we do each year. Our next one is scheduled for September 3rd and 4th in Indianapolis. This one is presented by DriveWise. Thanks to those folks for helping us out. This is the conference where we spend 2 days talking about nothing but DOT compliance, believe it or not. If that sounds exciting to you, hopefully it does to some folks, but probably not. May just be us. But anyway, if you're interested in joining us, or if you have anybody on your team that would benefit from an in-depth, deep dive discussion of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations and best practices for rolling out a cutting-edge fleet compliance program, we'd like to have you there with us. Trucksafebootcamp.com is where you'll find out the details, and that's where you could register yourself. This always fills up pretty quickly. We usually have around 100 or so fleet safety professionals in attendance with us, and so it's also a great networking event. And we've got a lot of stuff in store for this year, so hope to see you at that, trucksafenetwork.com. Anything else, guys? What's going on in the industry, aside from the big issue why we're here today?
The only other thing that really caught my eye this morning was fleets are starting to send in or make note of their quarterly earnings and stuff. And
yeah,
some of the big fleets, the quarterly earnings are down.
Not looking good.
So it was like the one I saw was like 7 straight quarters that it's been negative. That's getting tough to absorb, I'm sure.
No kidding. Yeah, we're going to try and have a show. I know we've talked internally. We're going to try and have a show all about kind of the current state of the economy and its impact on motor carriers and others in the supply chain here in the near future, probably in the next couple of weeks. Hopefully we can get that pulled together, and that will be an interesting topic for sure. Rob, anything else?
No, this was it.
Cool. Well, let's do it. Let's not waste any more time. Like I said, earlier this week, President Trump issued an executive order entitled Enforcing Common Sense Rules of the Road for America's Truck Drivers, taking aim primarily at English proficiency among regulated drivers in the U.S. Like I said, this has caused a bit of a stir in the industry. It seems to be the talk of the town, so to speak. And so I'm excited to have with us a couple of guests on with us who have both been on the show before, so I'm excited to welcome them back. First up, we've got Matt Leffler, the Armchair Attorney, as well as an adjunct professor of law at Michigan State University College of Law, and recently announced senior counsel at the Taylor Nelson Law Firm. Congrats on that, Matt. That was exciting.
Thank you, sir. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. Glad to have you back. And then Mr. Jack Van Steenburg, principal founder of CMV Safety Experts, LLC, and a safety expert helping motor carriers, attorneys, and insurance companies with regulatory compliance. He brings years of hands-on knowledge of the FMCSA's enforcement and compliance program, serving previously as the agency's chief safety officer and executive director prior to his recent retirement. Welcome back, Jack.
Thanks, Brandon. It's an honor to be here, an honor to be here with your distinguished guests and partners.
Yeah, so we've got a pretty diverse crew here, all kind of looking at this particular issue from various lights. And so, yeah, I think it'll be good to just kind of walk through the executive order, talk about maybe its history, what exactly it's doing, what it's not doing, clear up some of the misconceptions that we've seen out there collectively on the executive order, and go through it like that. Sound good, guys?
Yeah.
All right, let's do it. Well, like I said earlier, there's 100 different ways we could probably take this, so probably need to keep it pretty structured here. So I think first things first, maybe we should kind of give a little bit of history of where this executive order is coming from. And so maybe I'll pitch it over to Matt. I saw you had posted on LinkedIn on your account a couple days ago the fact that this is not something new. This shouldn't be all that surprising to folks. This has been a rule that's been on the books for many years. So maybe you can kind of break down a little bit the background of where this executive order is coming from.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that. And for those who've been following along with this the president's order and the rules that have been here previously, this is not new. Since 1937, we have had this kind of a regulation on the books. It requires you to understand and communicate in English when you're on the roads. It's a safety thing. It's not new, but we've seen changes of the enforcement. That's the thing I think is what we might look at as novel right now, is how do you enforce this thing and how do you make sure the roads remain safe?
Yeah, Jack, similar question to you. Having been at the agency around the time, I think, when we saw some developments on this. So the rule itself that Matt mentioned is 49 CFR 391.11B2. Let me pull it up here. I've got this somewhere. Here it is. This is the rule that has been on the books, as I understand it, in some form or fashion dating back to the 1930s. And so you can read it here. If you can read English, no pun intended. Except as provided in subpart G of this part, a person is qualified to drive a motor vehicle if he or she can read and speak English, the English language sufficiently to converse with the general public, to understand highway traffic signs and signals in the English language, to respond to official inquiries, and to make entries on reports and records. And so my question to you, Jack, is this rule, even though it's been on the books for many decades, as Matt said, the question has been, is it enforced and to what extent? And so as I understand it, in around 2015, 2016, the FMCSA, the agency that kind of oversees the enforcement of this regulation in particular, came out with some memorandums addressing this particular topic and its enforcement. Were you around the agency during that time? I think you were. And if so, did you have any insight into kind of that issue at that time?
Yeah, I was around, and a memo came out in 2016. And if you look at the memo, and this is an interesting thing, and in there at my level, you dealt with the political realm at all the times. So this was 2016. President Obama was in office at the time. And if you look at that memo right at the beginning, one of the last sentence is at the direction of the Office of Secretary Transportation and the Department of Justice. This is why we're removing this. We won't be enforcing this as an out of service regulation. I mean, so you don't see enforcement memos like that at all. And I couldn't remember it, and then I had to go look it up, and I found it, and I said, wow, definitely it's political.
It was coming from the higher ups for sure.
Yeah, and the author of that, Bill Quaid, he he took a lot of heat over that memo, but I know where it came from. He knew where it came from. If people read into it and read what I just said, Office of Secretary of Transportation and the Department of Justice, you know why he had to change it. So this isn't something he just made up out of the blue.
Yeah.
And then prior to that, that was June of 2016. CVSA took it out as a out of service, took it out of their out of service criteria. And the reason they did that was out of service is supposed to prevent the regulations in the out of service criteria is supposed to prevent crashes. There was no data that said not speaking English will lead to a crash. So that was the reason they took it out. And I don't know, I wasn't at that meeting when they took it out and so forth, but I know there was a lot of discussion back and forth between FMCSA and CVSA at the time.
That data problem is one that I want to get into a little bit later because, I think there are still legitimate questions about whether there is data to support this move or not. If there is, I haven't seen it, but we'll get to that in a second. You mentioned, Jack, CVSA's involvement. For folks not familiar, I'll turn this over to Brian because I know you've been involved in CVSA. You've attended their meetings and stuff like that. If you can give folks a sense of kind of the role that CVSA plays in this whole thing and with out of service conditions in general.
So every year, any updates that are made to the out of service criteria are republished in the handbook that comes out every year, and it's very clear with pictures and descriptions and things like that of out of service. And like Jack said, when in 2016 when this all came down, they really didn't have a choice but to remove it. So I sitting in those meetings, I'm sure that the conversation was very heated from state to state at that time. And it almost seems like they're doing kind of an emergency session now to
Yeah.
put it back into the out of service criteria. We'll probably see something come through them here in the next, I would think, next few days.
Yeah, and I'll turn it back
Whether
over to Matt to kind of highlight the timing of this. So you've kind of studied the executive order, and I guess my first question to you, Matt, is because I've seen some misunderstandings on social media in particular about what exactly is an executive order and what role does it play and what's its relationship with federal laws and stuff like that. If you can give us a kind of breakdown of how that works.
Man, that's a
Since
great, that's a
you're
heavy
a professor
question.
of law.
I mean, executive orders have the same kind of strength and effect as a statute, right? So when they put out this guidance, to put out this order, it's going to tell you right now, DOT officers are going to start giving you warnings. If you're not able to show or demonstrate your proficiency in English, you're going to start getting warnings. This will likely escalate over time. I would put this out there for the audience, right? The FMCSA is a $1 billion a year organization, 1,000 employees, set to regulate 550 some odd thousand motor carriers, 25,000 brokers, 4,000 interstate bus companies, and millions of commercial drivers. And they are struggling, in the environment today to enforce vehicle safety, for example. We have been telling ourselves as an industry, at least some have, about driver shortage. We need to bring in more people from other places. And this is simply, I think, the natural progression of this type of a rule. You get people driving vehicles. And so we're going to see a lot of things happen. I'm not sure if I'm chopping up here. My internet's
bit. You're
unstable,
okay.
just like my mental capacity, it looks like.
You're okay.
But so, I mean, I think that's what we're going to see over the next couple of weeks is we're going to see this enforced far more aggressively than it has previously. And we'll have to deal with that consequence.
Yeah, so the executive order, by its own terms, gives U.S. DOT and by extension FMCSA 60 days to rescind that memorandum from 2016 that Jack mentioned that had, taken this English proficiency violation off the list of out-of-service criteria. And as we've talked about, CVSA is going to have to be involved because they're the ones that publish these out-of-service criteria that go out to all of the roadside enforcement officers that are out there doing these types of inspections. So that's what's to come. Rob, you've posted a lot about this on your social media channels, and I know you've got some hot takes on this, so I'm interested to hear your kind of, 30,000 foot level view of this development.
It's definitely not law, but it's 30,000 foot for sure. So I think one of the things that I think everybody can agree with, I mean, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, Jack, but we can all agree that it's good to speak and be able to communicate in the English language when operating on the highways. Like one of the things I put out there is when I go to Wales, if you've ever been to Wales and you don't know Welsh, you're going to look at their road signs and just be totally confused. You're not going to be able to read that jumble that's on that sign. So it's no different in our country. I mean, I think it's important to be able to read, speak, and communicate the English language. It's always been a rule, like Matt said, back to 1937. And then I think they started actually enforcing it as an out of service in 2005, and then they stopped for reasons we've already talked about. But I think what I don't like about it is I feel like we've got bigger problems on our highways than people that can't read, write, or speak the English language, right? The demographics that I put out from FMCSA's report last year, there's not very many people that operate CMVs that can't read, write, or speak English. So when I'm thinking about what's actually affecting highway safety, I'm thinking distraction is probably the biggest one in 2025. Everybody's on their phone. Everybody's doing something else besides the driving task that's at hand. And then you've got sobriety with legalized marijuana. And there's so many other things that I think we have bigger issues with than not being able to speak, read, or write the English language. While it's important, I just don't think it's one of those. I think it's a hot button topic because it fits certain narratives, right? Like it's drawn a lot of people in. It started our truck stop rumor mill where I tell other drivers about it. We all get hyped up about it, and then it goes to another group of drivers. So I think it's just one of those hot button topics. I mean, if we go to a truck stop right now, and Matt, if you and I talk at a truck stop about the country skillet food killing us today and making us like 300, 400 pounds, it's not going to spread very far, right? It's not the narrative that we're interested in talking about.
I don't think
This
you're going
is
to
good.
find Matt at the truck stop.
Well,
I travel from time to time. I do from time to time.
Yeah. So Rob, I completely agree, and it goes back to Jack's point about this being so politicized. And we saw this at the Matt's conference when we went. Brian and Rob, folks up in arms about it, and FMCSA had their sessions at Matt's where they're speaking directly to truck drivers and the drivers. This was the issue that they wanted to discuss with FMCSA at the time, and it was clear that FMCSA didn't want to discuss it at that time. But here we are a couple weeks later, and now it's coming from top down, so they're going to have to address it. You all kind of hinted at something that I think it's a big part of this that we should talk about, and that's the executive order. It claims that the 2016 memorandum that took this out of the out-of-service criteria has led to a decrease in safety. And this brings to bear the issue of whether there is data to support the idea that non-English speaking drivers or their inability to read road signs or communicate with law enforcement is contributing to a significant percentage of accidents or not. If that data exists, like I said, I haven't seen it. There are certainly anecdotal stories about it out there. And the one that comes to my mind is the first ever $1 billion jury verdict case from Florida from 2020, I think is when that came down. And that was a case that involved a couple of regulated drivers who were operating near Jacksonville, I believe. And one of the drivers that slammed into a line of traffic and ended up killing a person who was coming down from Canada. He had several problems. I think he was over his hours of service limits by many hours, and there were all kinds of issues. But one of the big issues in that case was he had admitted that he was a non-English speaking driver and that he wasn't able to read the flashing signs that had been placed on the roadway to indicate that the traffic ahead was stopped due to a previous accident. He admitted that, and that was one of the contributing factors, not the contributing factor, but one of many that led to that first ever $1 billion jury verdict being awarded against those two trucking companies. So certainly there are anecdotal stories like that, but is anybody on here aware of any statistics or data that is out there that addresses the impact of non-English speaking drivers or their inability to read road signs on the highway accidents?
Brandon, when I was at FMCSA, I looked at the crash data on a regular basis. I mean, as the chief safety officer, I did so much analysis. I had teams, and I can count to 5. That's the most I've seen where English language proficiency was addressed in any type of crash report. I mean, it wasn't a factor at all. It was never part of a discussion that we have to do. And, quite frankly, I have not seen any data. When I saw that in the order, I go, okay, where are they getting the data?
I've seen other people post that they come up with these statistics and they're like putting out percentages of crashes involving non-English speaking drivers. I don't know where they're pulling that data. I don't know if they're just making it up. Or if that data exists, I would like to see it, but I haven't.
But is that the cause of the crash? I mean,
exactly.
There may be non-English drivers, but are they the cause of the crash?
Yeah, because that's the real question.
That happened. Remember the crash in Colorado where the driver was coming down the hill?
Yep.
And a lot of people thought he couldn't read the signs.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the case, but he had bad brakes.
Yeah.
Correlation doesn't equal causation all the time. So it's like my post from the other day where ice cream sales and shark attacks go up in the summertime. Obviously, they both go up in the summer, but are they directly correlated to one another? Absolutely not. So it's the same thing here. One of my issues with the Arkansas law specifically was they brought up someone who was supposed to be one of the largest tow company operators in Arkansas to testify for the legislature to get this thing passed. And if you look at them, they have 8 trucks. And I'm like, okay, well, maybe that is one of the largest in Arkansas. I don't know. But with 8 trucks, it doesn't seem like it should be. And then the data set that he presented, which I don't know where it came from, was 80% of the commercial motor vehicle crashes that he worked as a tow operator were people who couldn't speak English or communicate in English.
Mhm.
And my initial thought is, how do we come up with that? Is that one of the things like when Rob speaks, it's like, well, 97% of people, it's either coming out of thin air or it's coming from somewhere. And being we don't collect that kind of data from crashes to say whether you can speak English or not, I don't know where you get the data from.
Yeah.
It's an interesting question.
Go ahead,
And I
Go
don't
ahead,
know
Matt.
if I'm going to break up, so hopefully I don't break
good.
up too much. But so the thing is, like, I was talking to an FMCSA regulator at a conference a couple months ago about vehicle maintenance. And I said, why, as we have 20% of all vehicles, like, not satisfy FMCSA safety? And they said, well, we believe that it's the driver behavior that causes fatalities. It's not the maintenance of the vehicle. And so I asked the question, like, are we satisfied with 20% of vehicles being unsafe at any speed? And my problem generally with the industry is the barrier to enter is so small. Like, we let the states do the testing and getting people certified. It might take you 6 weeks, might take you 3 weeks, then you can drive a commercial vehicle. And so these regulations, if we don't like them, get rid of them. And if we have them, enforce them. And ultimately, it might mean that we lose some capacity. And is that the worst thing in the world? I don't necessarily think so. What I do wish we would see is the FMCSA with more resources to enforce the existing regulations, because without the resources, these distinctions don't matter. Because I think the other guest's point is that we don't see a ton of data around this is what indicated that crash, but is it a contributing factor? Is it part of the calculus of how we think about these things? And ultimately, if we've had this on the books for almost 100 years in some form or fashion, we can't act surprised if we're going to start enforcing it again. So I think what we're going to see over the next few weeks and months is more and more warnings, and then maybe we start seeing people start making some, out of service criteria, and people get knocked out of service. It's very interesting though.
And Matt, you brought up an interesting point, one that seems to be getting a lot of attention in social media. And here, this kind of highlights it. Somebody's asking, how are these drivers obtaining a CDL to start when the CDL test has to be taken and passed in the English language? That's a question I've had for years. Rob, Brian, you guys probably have best sense of how this is playing out in the states that are kind of pushing drivers through.
I think a couple of the things that I'm seeing, one, maybe the school isn't as ethical as it should be, and the testing facilities work hand in hand with some of these schools. So that's number one. Number two, if you have a Spanish speaking driver, you can get a Spanish speaking tester. Believe it or not, for like the pre-trip, where they have to go through and do the pre-trip and even the on-road piece of it. So I think that's how a lot of it's getting accomplished. But I think that there's a lot of side deals going down between schools and testing facilities, quite honestly.
Yeah, why is that a thing, Jack? It's something I never understood, why the agency didn't, and maybe they did, and I just didn't see it, dig into that with the CDL schools specifically, because, the only reason generally to get a CDL is to operate a regulated vehicle, and to operate a regulated vehicle, you are subject to this English proficiency requirement. So why would states be allowing drivers to use translator apps and stuff like that to get the CDL if ultimately the end result is they're going to have a CDL and be subject to this rule that would probably, disqualify them from operating if that regulation were enforced?
Well, FMCSA should be, there's a couple of things they should be doing. I know they were, to what extent, I don't know. I can't remember. Doing state CDL audits.
Yeah.
And then they should be doing, when I left, they were just starting up. Now I left in 2003 or 2023. They were just starting up an audit program of the new entry-level driver training schools, which I think is way overdue. Maybe, they'll be looking for that a little bit more now. I don't think they were really looking at it.
To build off that point. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Brian.
All right, thanks, Matt. One of the things that goes into play with that is, we talked about the 1,000, Matt, you mentioned the 1,000 people that work for the FMCSA. That's continuing to shrink.
That's right.
As people take federal buyouts and early retirements and stuff like that. So between audits and monitoring the medical examiners and the schools and the this and that, I mean, where are they going to find the people to actually do this?
To build off that point, it's like we and I talked before, Brandon, about the ELD mandate. Okay, now we all have to have ELDs. How do you know it's the right ELD? Well, the manufacturer self-certifies. It's not the FMCSA checking it out and saying, we've tested it, we think it's going to work. We have we've been since 1980, a deregulated industry, letting people kind of do what they want to do, let the states do the testing they want to do. And we have these rules on the books, then people choose or aren't able to enforce them. And then you get the supply chain, not that you want, you get the supply chain that you deserve. And this is the supply chain we deserve. And we wring our hands saying we don't like this particular rule, but I don't know if we're going to see a ton of enforcement in this. It'll be interesting the next few months to see if they actually put resources to it, or is it just some political statement to get people riled up and excited, maybe embolden more states like Arkansas did and say, oh, we're going to enforce it on ourselves. Like, I don't know how this plays out, but it'll be interesting to watch.
I think there's
there is one thing that you got to consider too, and I don't know if this has been discussed. And when you put a driver out of service for English language deficiency, where's that driver go?
Yeah. What do you do with them?
I mean,
he gets on the tow
he's out
truck.
of service. There's no 10-hour rule where you sit in the cab. I mean,
you
where
don't
does
learn
that
English in
driver
10
go?
hours.
So
You
so-
download the Babbel app, and then you use the
Exactly.
Babbel app, I
Yeah.
think.
Yeah.
Well, that was the question.
And to build off that too, Jack, is okay, now the driver's sitting. Then what do you do with the truck, the trailer, and the load?
yep.
You
Well,
know,
what I see is, I mean, the inspector, the state trooper, whoever's inspecting, they're not going to wait there. I mean, they got other things to do. They're going to tell the driver he's got to come and he's got to get somebody to pick him up. Maybe he can't understand that either, but they're going to slap an out of service order there. The trooper leaves, the inspector leaves, that driver's driving. I mean, that's what I
You
see.
hop on gen logs and you watch that truck just start moving again. Absolutely.
There's
Go
no
ahead, Rob.
clearinghouse for English proficiency yet.
Yeah.
But I think one part of getting licensed, like for instance, in Virginia, if I teach you at a community college in Virginia, and for people who don't know in Virginia, like Brian said, some of these schools are pretty shady. I think up until 2010, most of the community colleges in Virginia were run by a school, a third party that was run by the mob. And his program was eventually put out. It's a real story. Rob's not just making this up. But the other part of that became third-party examiners, right? So if I'm going to teach you how to drive a truck in Virginia for you to get your CDL at John Tyler Community College, I'm going to take you through all of the requirements that I have to take you through for ELDT, and then some other items. But then at the end of that, you're not going to test with me unless I'm a third-party examiner, right? So I think one of the big holes is third-party examiners. So the school can still be shady, but you're going to get a state examiner unless you have a third-party examiner that's doing the exam. And generally, a state examiner is not going to let you pass, where I think a third party is more likely. So I think part of it's the third-party examiner piece. But another important piece with this is the ELD part that I think is a bigger issue than all of this, because there's no real time requirement for ELDT. And I know that doesn't really have anything to do with the English language, but earlier when I was talking about we have bigger problems on our highways, I think it all goes back to this root of who are we actually letting get on the highway in a vehicle, whether that's a CDL or whether you're a teen driver. I mean, there's teen drivers that get in a car with me to get their teen license. And in 13 states, there's no requirement for you to drive a car, right? There's no practical knowledge behind the wheel portion. And everybody's like, what's that got to do with a CDL? Well, you get that like 4 years before you get a CDL. If you get a teen license and then you don't know how to drive and you practice for 4 years, not really knowing how to drive, and then you get your CDL, what do we expect is going to happen out of CDL, especially if you have ELDT with no time requirement? ELDT is great, but if I can teach you ELDT and cover all the modules for range, behind the wheel, classroom in 4 hours, what did you really get out of that?
Yeah. There several comments coming in through LinkedIn. I want to get to some of them. This one goes to the question I posed. Why are we letting CDL schools push through drivers who may run afoul of this regulation? Tom on LinkedIn is saying DPS can only offer the commercial driver's license knowledge test in English or Spanish. Interpreters are prohibited during the administration of the CDL skills test. Applicants must be able to understand and respond to verbal commands and instructions in English by a skills test examiner. Neither the applicant nor the examiner may communicate in a language other than English during the skills test. I think this was for Texas specifically. So yeah, that makes sense. I think those are good checks on the system, but my question still is, why are you offering the test in Spanish if you're going to have a regulation on the books that say that driver's not going to be qualified if that's the only language he can understand on the test? Although to your point, if he's having to respond to verbal commands in English, maybe that gets to it. Go ahead, Matt.
It'd be interesting to see if the schools themselves can be held responsible for passing somebody who can't pass that proficiency. I mean, this is the cottage industry of these for-profit schools that are pumping out people like a CDL mill, just more meat for the grinder. And then if they get tagged with something, then they disappear. But ultimately, there has to be some level of accountability. As we talked earlier, there is not enough enforcement resources for everyone who's watching in this big regulation. And there's a lot of people who have lots of strong opinions. I wouldn't have a strong opinion about this. I mean, realistically, even if it has been not really heavily enforced for a decade, it's still not going to be heavily enforced now because we don't heavily enforce anything in this country. And we continue to watch the same trajectory of vehicle maintenance continuing to be way, way worse than it ought to be. And I just don't think we're going to see a massive change other than some warnings and a few big stories. But without investment in more enforcement resources, I just don't see this being anything major to write home about.
It's going to be
I think
tough.
we're going to see certain locations have a huge spike.
Yeah.
That's
I
fair.
think, Arkansas has already said that they're putting their foot down. Well, the thing about Arkansas is, as we were talking about before we came on, that's a major thoroughfare for people coming from Texas up into the Midwest with loads coming across the border through Laredo. And, there's a lot of non-English speaking drivers running that route with auto parts and things like that. So I think we'll probably see the spike in that.
It's going to lead us into another problem, which is a problem we've been complaining about for years, which is disparate enforcement across the states and jacking up carriers' CSA scores in certain categories when they have heavy operations in those states that choose to focus on a particular area. So the carriers that have heavy operations in Arkansas, for example, may see a relative spike in their driver fitness category going forward with them enforcing the English proficiency. I've seen an issue come up several times on LinkedIn that I think it's important we talk about, and it's the interplay of these federal rules, the federal rule that we've talked about to date, or to this point, 391.11, and intrastate. We've done a lot of content on the distinctions between interstate and intrastate commerce and the MixApp program. Jack, I know you mentioned MixApp, and somebody else mentioned, well, hey, these drivers can operate intrastate in Texas, right? And so that it really brings to bear the question of MixApp funding and how that plays into the whole enforcement mechanism. So just generally speaking, I'll give kind of the broad answer since I just wrote an article on this not too long ago, so it's fresh in my mind. So generally speaking, I think every state in the country, Jack can correct me if I'm wrong, but every state in the country to one extent or another is part of the Motor Carrier Safety Assistance Program, MixApp. This is a federal funding program where the federal government is giving the states money to help them enforce their, highway safety initiatives and that type of stuff. But as a condition to receiving those federal funds, the states have made some promises to the FMCSA specifically. And those promises are outlined in the regulations. I think Part 350 of the regulations specify to what extent the states have to comply with these rules in order to be eligible for that MixApp funding, one of which is that they have to agree to adopt and enforce the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations. The regulation goes on, though, to say that there are certain areas of the regulations that the states are free to adjust or modify to their liking, and not lose their federal funding because of it. So this is the reason we see a lot of states have raised or have lowered the age limit for commercial drivers to 18. At the federal level, it's 21, but most states have lowered that down to 18. That's one area that the MixApp regulations allow the states to deviate from the federal rules. But if you look in any state code, you are generally going to find their adoption of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations. And in order to keep that funding, one thing that they cannot do is be more lenient on issues that the FMCSA has not told them they can be more lenient on. They will risk their federal funding if they do that. The English proficiency requirement, I don't believe, Jack, correct me if I'm wrong, is one of the ones that they are explicitly allowed to deviate from and still get their MCSAP funding. Am I wrong on that? Do you know off the top
No,
of your
you're
head?
correct, Brandon.
Okay. And so my point in saying that is to the person or to the folks that are saying, well, can't they operate intrastate in Texas? I would say no. If Texas wants to keep their federal funding, they have to agree to adopt the federal safety regulations, apply them to intrastate commerce, and not in a way that is more lenient in areas that the FMCSA hasn't allowed them to be more lenient in. And so that's kind of my, quick, I haven't dug into that obviously in any depth, but that's my quick take on.
I would like to get your thoughts on this, Brandon.
Yeah.
So if someone they have to have the English proficiency, officer pulls them over in Texas, it's really the officer's discretion or determination if they're proficient enough to communicate. So
yes,
ultimately, this is not the same as like the AIDS thing where it's like, I feel 18 today, or I feel 19
very
today.
subjective.
Yeah, so it's going to be up to I think the states are going to continue to have some latitude, because if an officer doesn't want to write you up for not being able to communicate in English in a way that's proficient, they're not going to. But if they want to, that's the other thing. I would say for the local trucking associations, state level trucking associations, if you have an enforcement arm that is more prone to finding you being less proficient, you want to coach your drivers and make sure you're prepared for that.
For sure.
Well,
yeah,
and I'm gonna jump on-
subjectivity is huge. Yeah, go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, I'm going to jump on that a little bit, Matt. Are they going to put some sort of standardized test together? Almost like a DUI test. There's certain elements that
Field
everybody
sobriety.
follows.
Field proficiency.
Field sobriety test. There's a certain test that they kind of stay close to. And the other thing that I'm concerned about is the one example that I can think of is the transmitting of logs from the ELD. I would not like to see somebody get, out of service for the English proficiency when it was a failure to understand what the officer's asking for rather than a failure to understand English. Yeah. Because we see plenty of those violations come across from, that they're English speaking people. They just don't understand the command or don't know how to do it. Yes, it's a training issue for the trucking company, but that request is not necessarily an admission of guilt that they can't speak English. Yeah. So those are the two things that
I would rely on the famous test distributed by Dr. Seuss in the one fish, two fish, red fish, blue fish vein. That might be the next pathway forward, I suspect.
Yeah, that's a good one. I've thought a lot about this subjectivity issue because I think that's one of the big questions that's out there, and that the FMCSA and the CVSA are going to have to address is how do we take what is such a subjective thing? Are you proficient in this language according to the officer that's stopping you and talking to you? How do we make that less subjective? Kind of thinking through, I was trying to think through, are there any other regulations like this in the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations that are so subjective? And the only one that I could really think of off the top of my head, there's a regulation that you see cited roadside sometimes that prevents commercial drivers from operating vehicles while they are ill or fatigued. And so you'll see a violation occasionally for a driver being ill or fatigued. And so I guess that's somewhat akin to it. How is an officer to know whether this driver is ill or fatigued? It's somewhat subjective, but that's the only one I could really come up with. So I think the point is, and I think this probably lands mostly on CVSA, the body that's kind of generating or coming up with standards that law enforcement across the country is going to subscribe to. I think it lands on them to figure out a way to make this less subjective and implement some kind of test roadside or whatever they're going to come up with to end up writing these violations.
One of my big things with this too is, we've talked a lot about the roadside piece of it, right? You're getting pulled over. An officer has to determine whether you're proficient, but then how does that change the workflow of your hiring process, right? Like, what are you going to put in place as a carrier to decide, hey, obviously I have to do my clearinghouse and my MVR, background check, drug test, et cetera, et cetera. like, what is the proficiency standard that I'm going to build in my fleet to determine whether this person can proficiently speak and read, write, communicate English before I put them on the road? Because ultimately, if they get a violation for it, it's going to affect you too. So, especially if you get back to Brian, hey, what do we do with the truck, trailer, and driver now that it's on the side of the road? Yesterday, I got a call and I hit up Brandon and Brian and Jared and was like, hey, look, XYZ down in Florida is like all Somali, and none of them hardly speak English. So it's their question to me was, what do we do here? How do we handle this? Because we're teams, we're mostly Somali. What do we do now? And it's like, well, we have to wait and get some guidance on it first, but you're going to have to develop some kind of way to start weeding out people who can't, or you're going to have to start figuring a way to accommodate it to either teach them English, which isn't quick, right? So I don't know the answer to it, but I think there's going to have to be some consideration on the fleet perspective side for hiring and onboarding and recruiting and how you put these drivers in the truck, because ultimately the schools can get them the license.
Yeah.
It's ultimately going to be up to you to put them in the truck.
I liked your solution for that, Rob. You want to tell people your idea? Or do you want to keep it confidential so that we can implement it? The drive-away, tow-away company that we create.
Oh, yeah. It was a joke. That's why I didn't remember it. But my thought process, we could just start a drive-away company and was like, hey, you don't need to speak English because we can pick you up. But
we'll repower your load for you once it gets shut down.
Yeah, we'll fly out and pick you up. But
send that recovery driver out.
Yeah.
That's right. Recovery driver services.
We can't promise that Rob can speak English well enough to pass a test, but
and that was another consideration for me, because a lot of people tell me all the time, like, Rob, you have to open your mouth wide and enunciate every word that you say, slow it down, cut out the Southern, and really speak so we can understand you. Because Google and Alexa, you try to talk to them and they do not ever come up with the right thing. So then it gets back to the subjective nature of it. It's like, can you understand me at the roadside? I speak English. It's just not as coherent as Brandon.
So one of the big questions that's getting raised in LinkedIn and elsewhere is, what is the potential that this executive order is going to face some legal battles by groups like ACLU? I know, Brian, you had raised that as a potential concern. Matt, Jack, what are your thoughts on whether we're going to see any kind of court cases involving this executive order?
You'll see challenges, but they will be unsuccessful, in my opinion. I think that we have enough precedent from 100 years, essentially, of the same rule being in place. What I think will happen, and this is my guess, is we'll see most of this be something like warnings as opposed to actual citations. Because if you get a bunch of people getting citations and they want to fight them in court or something and prove beyond whatever the burden of proof is that I can actually communicate in English, that'll be something really, really interesting. My belief is we're going to have a lot of warnings, a lot of fines, and then it'll just continue on. But I cannot see a world where the federal government would lose on a rule saying we require you to communicate in English in a country that is speaking English. All the signs are English. I just don't see a world where they are successful challenging it.
Yeah, I agree. And Jack, I know you're no stranger to having to fight all these legal battles when these rules, I mean, you were around when the ELD rule got tied up in court for years. What's your take on this?
I agree with Matt. I don't see this being a bigger thing. I do see the states, and you talked about discretion earlier, Matt. The states are going to just apply a lot of discretion here. And then you look at the disparate, between states. And before I got on here, I was curious. So I went to some bigger states, California, Texas, and Florida. Minimal enforcement, and I say enforcement, roadside violations of the English language, minimal. And then I go up, I looked at, just for the heck of it, I looked at Illinois, Kansas, and New York, and all of them have far more roadside violations than the states that I, Texas, California, and Florida. And, I try to think of the reasons why. You may be a Spanish-speaking person in Texas. The troopers all probably understand the language, and they're not going to bother you or something like that. So there is an awful lot of discretion out there, but quite frankly, there's bigger fish to fry in this world, and to me, the job is to prevent these crashes from happening.
Yeah, I think that's right. I've seen a couple of people mention on here, I think, Brian, you mentioned this too, or Jack, maybe it was you, CVSA has already started the process of making this change They're in meetings. Either it was this week, I think, wasn't it, Brian, where they were in executive committee meetings, and from what I understand,
They just passed it, Brandon.
okay, they just
I was-
passed it.
So as Brian mentioned earlier, it passed out of the Driver Traffic Enforcement Committee. They
Okay.
voted to send it on to the Executive Committee. The Executive Committee met today. And if you saw me on my phone, which I try not to when I'm doing these things, I asked if they passed it, and the word I got back was yes, call me.
Okay, all right. Well, maybe we should take that call live on air. No, okay,
Well,
that
and
makes sense.
And
Go
that
ahead,
kind of, on what Matt was saying as far as the citations and the warnings and stuff like that, I think the big issue when it comes to drivers being put out of service, that's going to be on the inspection reports.
Yeah.
Whether it's citations or warnings, those can or may not have any financial aspect to them. That the out of service on the inspection report, that's going to be even harder to challenge or to do anything with, because if you get a fine, they send you on your way with the fine.
Yeah.
They put you out of service on the inspection report, then that is the death sentence for that load.
Yeah, in my view, that's the two big outstanding issues that are going to have to get fixed sooner than later, or addressed sooner than later, I should say, are the subjectivity of the enforcement of this, and then how does a driver get placed back in service once they've placed out of service for English proficiency? Is that even a thing that's going to be possible? As you guys all said, and as we all know from experience, in many cases, these drivers are just going to continue driving and just continue driving until they get caught again. And then the question then is there going to be some kind of escalation process? Hey, this particular driver received an out of service violation, 2 weeks ago for this same violation. What are we going to do about it now? He's going to be placed out of service again, obviously, but does then that get FMCSA's attention to start looking at the carrier, maybe, if it's the same driver with multiple English proficiency violations? I don't know.
Yeah, would they write them up for jumping an out of service order?
They would get that too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, possibly.
I'm really curious to see how the large brokerages react to this if we start seeing out of service things happening, because in the world of the contract rate, the old Dominions, Pitt, Ohio's, talking JB Hunt, like they know their drivers, they know their processes. They're not probably going to have the same issues, but in the world of the brokerage where they're working with most of the 1 to 6 truck fleets, you start losing a lot of loads and you start having to get a bunch of recovery drivers.
They're not going to have the patience for that.
Yeah, what is TIA going to do? How are they going to react? Because this will impact the brokerage industry far, far more than it will on the dedicated contract providers. So this could have I didn't even think about this until we're talking about it, but like now I realize like you could have CH Robinson and TQL on the phone saying, we don't want this anymore. So this will be really interesting.
This may make it into their contracts specifically. If it
testing the driver before they say, can you just fill out this little application before we allow you to go pick up this load? That's gonna be fascinating.
Yeah, read your 1 fish, 2 fish, red fish, blue fish, before they.
This one has a little car. This one has a little star. My, what a lot of funny fish there are.
All right, guys. Well, we've got a few more minutes left here. We've got a ton of comments and LinkedIn still. Probably not going to have time to get to them, but I do want to leave with a few minutes that we have left. We've kind of hit on this. Some of you have a little bit, but I want to give some practical tips or advice to carriers, the motor carriers out there that watch our show. What should they be doing, particularly if they have a driver force that is, largely non-English speaking? What should they be doing now? What should they be thinking about, and that type of stuff? So kind of go around the horn here. Rob, you want to start out?
Well, part of me wants to think about, like, is there a difference in how you look at this? For instance, are they already a driver? Are they already employed with us? And then how do you handle that one versus how do you handle new onboarding of applicants, right? So are you going to decide to accommodate them and teach them English or facilitate that educational aspect for existing drivers?
That's another huge issue I haven't even thought about.
Wrongful termination.
Wrongful termination.
Yeah. So you've got that aspect of it because you can't discriminate, right? Based on age, nationality, sex, etc. So there's all kinds of things to think about that. And so do you address it and accommodate it, or do you let them go and then have to deal with the fallout from that, potential fallout? And then there's the aspect of, all right, now how do we applicant Matt Leffler Santiago, how do we determine if you can speak, read, write, communicate English proficiently enough to work for us? So I think, and even that goes back to the broker side of what Matt was talking about. It's like, how is that going to affect what carriers brokers are willing to deal with based on how many people in their workforce can't read, write, speak English?
Because the subjectivity issue creeps back into the carrier side of things as well, and the employment concerns as well. I can imagine a scenario where you don't give the driver the job, or you terminate a driver because you believe that he can't speak English sufficiently. But then is that going to raise the subjectivity question in any subsequent employment, wrongful termination litigation or that type of stuff? So
I think there's got to be some objectivity there. It's like when we have crash committees at the enterprise and strategic fleet size level, when I put these in, the whole purpose of that committee after a crash is to decide objectively, what have we done with other drivers who have done the same thing in the past? How are we going to judge this? And then you have a committee that decides objectively, like, this is our criteria. This is what we're going to do. They're going to need training. They're going to need coaching. They're not coachable. This is their third time, whatever. But there has to be some objective criteria there that's overarching across everybody that's actually implemented consistently. So I think they have a lot to think about. One, from the aspect of, are they already employed? And two, how are we going to start hiring these people? How do we add that into our onboarding?
Yeah. Jack, I'll turn it over to you for closing thoughts, since I know you got to jump here soon.
Yeah, I mean, and I look at where you look at the drayage community, especially out in the West Coast and probably the Southern Coast, a lot of Ethiopian ethnicity there. So, and I've seen that firsthand where they can't speak English. They can't understand it. They had interpreters in a room when I was in there. But it goes back to now, when you're doing for the carriers, as Rob said, I mean, if you have a driver out there that's safe, proven to be safe, or hers that she's safe, it gives you a little bit more protection. But hiring a new person that, can't speak English, do you open yourself up to litigation possibility? That's something to think about. I go back to the beginning. I think Matt said, what's changed? I mean, It's been on the books for a while. It's not an out of service. Well, it is now through the CVSA. It's not, and CVSA is the North American Standard out of service criteria is mentioned in the regulations.
Yeah, it's adopted by reference.
390.05.
Yep.
And there are specific regulations that are mentioned in that same section for out of service carriers. So, it'll be interesting to see.
I've heard a lot of folks get that messed up too. They say, well, the out of service stuff is not even regulation. It is adopted by reference in the regulations specifically. So it is a regulation in a sense. One of your former colleagues, Daryl Rubin here, is commenting on LinkedIn. CVSA shouldn't change anything until the unified process supports the change. FMCSA will need to make a number of changes, but nothing will happen from the executive order until the office of the secretary provides guidance on the executive order, and that will all take some time, in my opinion. I don't doubt that in the least.
Yeah, it takes time.
All right, Matt, you want to give your last words, and then I'll let Brian wrap us up?
Yeah, I think that this is a wait and see sort of thing. I mean, are we going to start seeing people knocked out of service? That's going to be incredibly disruptive to the supply chain. We have a lot of other things going on. I've heard about tariffs moderately, some things buzzing about that. This is just another thing that's going to make it more difficult to be a motor carrier, be difficult to be a broker. When we see a profound change in enforcement, if we do see more resources or more states get emboldened, then we're going to have a capacity crunch. We will lose capacity. And that might be the thing we want to see happen. But ultimately, this is great for lawyers. I think it's great for all of us in the compliance and safety field. We need more things for lawyers to do. So thank you for everyone making chaos in the supply chain.
Yeah, perfect. All right, guys. Well, thanks for joining us. We're going to wrap things up here. Brian, you want to give the last word here since I didn't give you a shot there?
That's fine. Yeah, I would say pay attention to how enforcement rolls for the routes that you run on. I don't see, companies, especially smaller ones, getting rid of a bunch of drivers for all the reasons that were stated before. So pay attention to where the enforcement is. The ANI site is great, and just your general inspection data. So keep an eye on it.
everybody, we'll probably have a lot more to say on this topic and others, all pertaining to DOT compliance. So if you want to stay up to date with everything we've got going on, subscribe to our newsletter. That's the best way to do it. Trucksafe.com/subscribe. We push out a lot of content on DOT safety regulations, and we try not to spam you. So we'd love to have you a part of that. And stay tuned for further episodes. Trucksafelive.com is where you can watch all of our previous episodes, read guest bios. You can also subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for being here, everybody, and we really appreciate it. See ya.